Hi everyone, welcome to My Two Cents. I'm your host, Two Cents Girl, and this is the vlog where we talk about all things metal. Especially I like to weigh in on metal songs, often remasters, but sometimes just studio recordings too. Today we'll be examining What If Lux Aeterna Was on Kill 'Em All by StateofMercury. Now, earlier today I actually tried recording this, but the microphone was turned off, so I ended up recording for an entire hour, finishing it, and then realizing at the very end when I went to upload it to YouTube that the microphone had been turned off, so there was no sound. I have since rectified that issue, but what that means is that there will not be a genuine reaction this time. I had actually held off on listening to the song until I could sit down and record myself sort of responding to it for the first time. So I'll be able to break down my thoughts and feelings on it. I just won't be able to give you that genuine kind of reaction like I did the first time right out of the gate. So what we'll be doing, the basic format that I like to follow here is I listen to the song once, I talk through it as it's playing. At the end of the song, when it's stopped, I give my thoughts on it, and then I will talk about it for a little bit, just sort of reflect on what I've heard. And then I'll go through it a second time and sort of pause the song and talk about it piece by piece. I also, in this particular video, at the end of the video, I wanted to kind of discuss the history of the What If trend as it ties to StateofMercury. His channel's been around for a while, and there are some other channels that are connected to it that I've come to know over the years. So I wanted to discuss that as kind of a musical movement that sprung up around Metallica's latter-day albums, especially Hardwired to Self-Destruct, and their latest album, which, to be perfectly honest, I still don't know the name of. I just know the name of their one single so far. In any event, without further ado, I'd like to play the song and just give my thoughts on it. Real quick before the song starts, this is actually a collab between StateofMercury. The vocals are by Blake Arendell, and the bass is by StackerTheEOD. So, having listened to this already, I can say that these three work really well together. But I just wanted to sort of pause and highlight this. This isn't a solo project. Custom vocals, custom bass, and then custom guitars and lead guitars, and I believe the drums are sampled. So right off the bat, the guitar chords hit you. No build up, just right out the gate, we're thrashing. You got the tom roll, and then you have the guitar pan to the left. The drums are kind of all around you. Then the vocalist and the rest of the band joins in. Very much in that sort of 80s recording style. You can hear the bass too. It's kind of quiet, but I love that when it gets quiet and it's just the guitars again. There's a great use of dynamics. And here we have the vocals. And they sound really, really good. This isn't just a raised pitch, but it's literally someone who is coached to sing a particular way. And it sounds a million times better. And it's the same lyrics too, they're just sung differently. The production here is very clean sounding. It sounds like a remaster of the original album where they were able to just scrub everything away. sort of a modern production approach, but somehow capturing the sound of the original instruments. There's just no like fuzz, so it's sort of a cross between a studio recording and being faithful to the original instruments. I love that freaking sort of screaming style. You have those bluesy, doomy kind of Black Sabbath meets Merciful Fate riffs, but sped up in that Metallica thrashy style that started in the early 80s. You can hear the bass there too. It's fairly faint, but it's still audible despite how prominent the other instruments are. Nothing feels over-compressed. And the solo is announced by the refrain, the solo riff. And the riff just keeps playing while the soloist is going. So you can listen to one or the other. The panning is pretty good too. Like the riff is kind of panned more to the right. The solo is panned more to the left. And this sounds like a bona fide solo. It's definitely less patchwork and compartmentalized than Kirk's solo was on the studio recording. Has kind of a shorter straw feel to it because it's cleaner sounding, but it still has that raw, rough and tumble kind of feel to it. Then we're back to the verse, or the pre-verse. Again, good use of exchanging, dynamics where you have one instrument playing, then they all join in again. That happens throughout the song, not just at the start. I can hear the hi-hat there. That syncopated hi-hat. That lightning to the nations, which is a nod to Diamond Head. It really lets it belt there at the end. That new wave of British heavy metal emphasizing each kind of note, almost like a melody that has a power chord feel. On the downbeat where everything's just kind of playing, hammering at home. And no harmonies the way that they would stack them in And Justice for All, but rather they would basically just have the power chord, and then they would double that with a double stop, and they would have the double stop and the power chord. It sounds like, or maybe they're just doing double stops kind of thing, but it that kind of stacking. So it's more of a blues, heavy metal kind of approach to things, as opposed to the more Hydra-like pipe organ style melody voicings that they would have on And Justice for All, where there's just a lot more voices. To be fair, I think it was largely it almost sounds unison, or maybe they would just stack thirds on top of each other, but in any event, it sounded a lot less sort of raw and aggressive, because there's a difference between like having a power chord and a double stop playing together and just having like harmonized notes. It creates a pretty different feel. And yeah, that was a very, very impressive outing. And I know I don't sound as effusive here as I should be, because believe me when I say this, that this is easily StateofMercury's best performance to date. I followed the channel for years, and he started off with What If videos, where What If Metallica recorded this on the Black Album. And while those are pretty good, he would break off into other content. What if this was on Ride the Lightning? What if this was on And Justice for All? So he's done all the classic albums. And also, I believe, Saint Anger, of course, which I never really listened to. I always treated that as kind of a joke. But I will say that it sounds pretty authentic. But it was never really something that I enjoyed quite as much. And that being said, this is a collab. So you have a different bassist in past videos, I believe that State would play the bass himself. So this time around, you have someone else playing the bass. Stacker is playing the bass. And that sounds good. It has a similar tone to Cliff, of course. The volume sounds pretty similar. Kill 'Em All is a record where you can hear Cliff playing, and with the exception of Amnesia Pulling Teeth, you can't really you can't make him out too strongly. Like, he's present, but he's not like overly present, and it's largely drums and guitar and James's vocals, but not so much. It's not a very bass heavy recording, but it's still heavier than, say, And Justice for All, where there's literally no bass. And I think that feels pretty authentic. And because the album sounds cleaner than Kill 'Em All did, like, the instruments sound the same, but they've been cleaned up to such a degree that there's no like fuzz or noise or dirt or grime in between the instruments. So it sounds like a studio recording where all of the tracks are isolated and you have effects applied afterwards. It's a very modern approach, and you can hear everything playing individually, but it still feels cohesive. And during that, it's kind of easy, or easier than it would be on the original record, to make out the bass. The drums, I believe, are samples where State, based on my interview with him, he explained that he would take the individual drum components and he would basically cut them and paste them together. And I want to say that he's not doing longer like drum fills, but individual drum components from the stem track, basically cutting them individually, like each drum beat almost, and making his own drum fills and drum beats. I don't know if he's getting that quite involved with it, but that's what it sounds like sometimes. And because I'm not really, the individual drum fills aren't really leaping out at me like, oh, I recognize this drum fill from this particular Kill 'Em All song. The end result, though, is you have that three-dimensional kind of playing where Lars is having like these three-dimensional tom fills that will come from the left over to the right and back and forth, and you have a variety of volume, and he's able to kind of play around with that in a way that sounds really authentic, I think. If he hadn't told me that was the way that he produced his drums, and then I heard this, I might mistake this for a live recording that was just recorded really well. And it doesn't have a drum machine feel like something like And Justice for All does, for instance, or like drum samples where they haven't really been given the attention that they need and they sound kind of artificial or fabricated or just inserted into the song, but they're obviously not an actual drummer in the studio kind of thing. So the drums and the bass sound good. The vocalist, Blake, does an amazing job here. Easily, I mean, everything here is firing on all cylinders, but I think Blake does an especially good job emulating that young James style, where you're not just taking the vocal track of old James singing in 2022 and raising the pitch, because then the dynamics, the way that he's stressing things, sounds very much how he would in the here and now, as opposed in 1983. And point in fact, young James didn't always have a screamy vocal style. He originally, in some of the early demo tapes, actually was emulating the singer from Diamond Head, who had a more tuneful crooning style, and then he would go on to sort of do his own thing with it and be more pissed off and really have kind of a guttural vocal fry in the back of his throat, not so much head voice, or not so much screaming and louder with head voice. And similar to Dave Mustaine, except it's more legible than Dave Mustaine, and Dave Mustaine has more of a nasally kind of approach to his growls, and I think James never really leaned that far into it. But you can hear in this song just how much attention to detail and how closely the vocalist is trying to emulate the singing style of young James, like from top to bottom, and it feels very authentic. And we'll go more into that when I listen to the song again, but I just wanted to say nice job from Blake and Stacker. You guys absolutely fucking kill it, and you work really well with State. You guys make a really effective trio, so I would definitely love to hear more from the three of you together. And another thing I guess I wanted to weigh in on was just the history and where this all sort of sprung up. And the reason I want to say that is because I feel like StateofMercury, with this particular track, has sort of reached the peak of his powers, in part because he's working with other people, but you're working really well together. You're not just trying to do everything yourself, but it's a team effort where everyone's contributing in ways that feel very authentic in terms of the what if Metallica did this. You're going to have to eventually enlist other people, unless you're like Jeff Waters from Annihilator and you're doing all of the instruments yourself, by and large, and you're just hiring, like, I don't know, a drummer and a vocalist maybe, if that, then you're going to have to bring other people on board. And hearing that, everything just kind of comes together here. One sort of complaint that I've had with State in the past is that his songs tend to be a little experimental in terms of how he combines riffs. He's definitely a riff master, and he's able to really do a lot of cool variation on old Metallica riffs to kind of insert little flavorful bits of And Justice for All into a Kill 'Em All riff, or vice versa, or some other album. So you can hear a riff that was on And Justice for All originally, but then if it's played on Kill 'Em All, he'll make it sound a little bit more malevolent and doomy, but still fast and thrashy, and there's a lot of different things going on. But here, instead of sounding kind of patchwork where there's a lot of different riffs and sometimes they feel a little bit clunky or there's just one too many riffs, I feel like here the balance is very, very good. There's enough new material to help the song stand out, and it's been rewritten and reworked, especially in the lead guitar and the guitar riff side of things. It really, really sounds different, and obviously the drums sound different too, but those again are sampled. Nobody's playing them, but they've been rewritten as well. And honestly, when I heard Lux Aeterna, the studio recording, I couldn't even hear Rob on bass. So the bass here, everything sounds entirely new. Like I think the bass was audible there, but it felt more in lockstep with Lars, to the point that I really couldn't make out individual notes. I don't know. It's just trying to think back on, I've listened to that song several times now, and it just doesn't, nothing really leaps out at me. But that's, Metallica's been that way for a long time. Really, everything after the Black Album, like And Justice for All and everything after the Black Album, there's just not really anything memorable in terms of bass. Almost nothing at all, really. And so that all sounds really good and great, but it comes together in a way that feels like the pinnacle of the Metallica What If movement, and specifically the second generation, because the first generation came with Andy Carrate, it came with Krebel Star and Guitar Raz, following Hardwired to Self-Destruct, where Andy Carrate is someone who does Metallica remasters, and he was sort of addressing a common problem that Metallica had, in that, you know, the first four albums in particular, they're all classic in terms of like the songwriting, and they were recorded for like AM, FM, like radio play, you know, to be played through stereo speakers, be those in a car or a sound system at home, but they were meant to be played on CD, on vinyl maybe, back in the day. CDs were big even in the 80s though, but people would have had vinyl, you know, record players, going to record stores, stuff like that. That wouldn't have been uncommon as a vintage medium even back then. But the recording style was meant to be through the equipment of the time, in the same way that a vintage video game would have been meant to be played through a CRT television set. And I think one thing that Andy Carrate did, even before Hardwired to Self-Destruct, was he's a professional sound technician, and he is originally from Egypt, and he lives in Denmark now, and he is someone who in his free time will take Metallica songs and remix and remaster the stem tracks to sort of clean them up, but also make them sound more potent, more powerful, modern recording techniques, things like that, that just really enhance the music, I think, and take it away from the recording limitations and choices of the time and bring it into the present without sacrificing any of the original sort of power and oomph. It's to not defeat but enhance the original sort of approach. And those decisions at the time were made by the engineers and by the band, by and large, because it made sense. But I think if you had to return to it, yeah, of course you're going to change various things. And I think that Aeterna sort of singled the start of that. And then you really didn't see Metallica What Ifs until after Hardwired to Self-Destruct came out. And in particular, you had Guitar Raz here, who did If Moth into Flame was on And Justice for All. And he actually did a couple of videos, I believe, where it was what if Hardwired to Self-Destruct was on And Justice for All. And it was like super, super basic, the first one, the second one. And then he releases this beauty. And this song in particular really just kind of cooks from start to finish. It really, really works. He did some tracks after this. Some of them I really like, but I remember this one most prominently as just sort of blowing me away. Like, this was that pivotal kind of watershed moment where he showed people this is what you can do with this kind of format, this kind of idea. And then shortly after that, you had Creeblestar, who did the same idea with What If Spit Out the Bone was on Kill 'Em All. And then he did Ride the Lightning. And then also Slayer, sort of that Rick Rubin, Angel of Death, like Rain and Blood sort of recording style. And all three of those worked really well too. And he's done some other recordings as well, Creeblestar and Guitar Raz, but they were kind of the first generation, even though Creeblestar is still making content to this day. Definitely worth checking out. He has a really, really awesome Mega Man 3 medley. It's unrelated to Metallica, but it's one of my favorites. And so he makes music other than Metallica What Ifs. And that's all well and good, but he also does Metallica What Ifs every once in a while. He did one for Lux Eterna, and I think I'll give that a listen as well. But the Guitar Raz, Andy Carade, and Creeblestar here, they're kind of the first generation, and then in between them and Metallica's latest album, so in between 2016 and 2022, you had people emerge, Bryce Barilla and StateofMercury in particular, and each one of them brought their own particular songwriting approach. Bryce has some really, really excellent production. His productions are very, very powerful sounding. I especially love To Live Is to Die. If it were on Ride the Lightning, this particular recording is good too. And then he did one, a Master of Puppets style recording that sounded pretty fabulous as well. And his sounded more conventionally song-like. And I think that the StateofMercury side of things was a bit more experimental in terms of what if this was on the Black Album, what if this was on Saint Anger, things like that. And it each one of them would focus on like different albums, different crossovers, and they would bring something different to the table. So that's kind of a summary of the overall history of the Metallica What If movement, because part of the reason that people even do that is because of the branding. Metallica is such a privatized neoliberal kind of band in terms of just the way that they own everything. I remember growing up in the early 2000s where you had the Napster lawsuits that were happening, and Lars was basically protesting music sharing and fighting that tooth and nail. And a lot of old bands do that. The Eagles, the person who owns the Eagles does that as well. They don't like their music to be shared online. And it's kind of an old man's approach to the way that music works, because there's just no way to really prevent music from being shared online unless you institute some fairly draconian measures. And instead, a lot of bands have leaned into the live performance kind of thing. Why do you think Metallica tours so often and they sell so much merchandise? It's because that's primarily where bands make their money nowadays. Making money through sales is a thing of the past. But nowadays, if Metallica releases a single or they do a new album, you have people who are kind of riding their coattails. You know, a rising tide raises all ships. And for better or for worse, Metallica is that tide. And when you have a new song coming out, you can use the branding as something that's recognizable. So what if Spit Out the Bone, it's a new single that, well, in 2016 was new. What if Spit Out the Bone came out, and then what if it was on Kill 'Em All? So you have reference to a new single from an old classic album, and then you have the branding here by Metallica. So the thumbnail, you literally are just using that super, super recognizable font by Metallica, and then just a quick and dirty thumbnail retooling the album art. So a lot of the work is already done in terms of how recognizable it is. It's very similar to like horror movies and slasher villains. Why go through all the effort of trying to make something new when you can just riff off something or respond to something that people already recognize and are going to tune into? Because a lot of Metallica fans are going to be like, oh, gee whiz, I wonder what Spit Out the Bone would sound like if it was on Kill 'Em All. And honestly, part of the whole point of the movement is that new Metallica from like, well, basically anything after the Black Album really hasn't sounded very good from a production standpoint, because as far as I'm concerned, Load, Reload, Sane Anger, Death Magnetic, Hardwired to Self-Destruct, oftentimes they're kind of trapped in this experimental phase where they're doing a lot of things to the instruments to make them sound, shall we say, less than optimal. The guitars really don't sound heavy enough. The drums either sound kind of flat or bone dry or downright unlistenable in the case of Sane Anger. And there's other things going on as well, just in terms of like compositionally and dynamically speaking, in terms of how the instrumentalists play their drums and their guitars. But in terms of just the audio production, I think the trend largely was Metallica's guitar tone nowadays just doesn't really hit as hard as it could. The drums don't hit as hard. I would like to hear some bass. So a lot of people are taking the same exact songs and replaying them with their classic tones. And even here with if Moth into Flame was, or I'm sorry, not that. If Lux Aeterna was on Kill 'Em All, people are State of Mercury is doing the same thing, where it's like, by and large, it's the same song. They're mixing it up and they're doing things more their own way compositionally. But then you have something like If Moth into Flame was on And Justice for All, where it's less adventurous. Like, there are different things going on that are different and new, but a lot of the stuff is kind of note for note the same. And it sounds a lot better just because they've swapped out the guitar tone. And that's the thing about Metallica, is if you get rid of Kirk's shitty solos, you mix up the drums a little bit more, and you just change the guitar tone on Kirk and James's riffs and the leads, it sounds a million times better right off the bat. A large part of it is just Metallica being stubborn and sticking to their guns and basically making the same recording mistakes in spirit that they've been making since, well, at least And Justice for All. Because every album was them kind of changing the guitar tone. They're not a very sonically consistent band in terms of that. And I think every band does that. Megadeth would do that too. Slayer would do that. Like, the guitars always sound different. Like, they don't stick to the same settings. And which I get to a certain degree because it does help keep things fresh. But then if you pull a Metallica and you start leaning into tones that don't work as well, and then you stick with those and you abandon all of the old tones, I just feel like it's like Wheel of Fortune, where you lose big time in terms of chasing tones. Why did they have to end on the tone and the audio production that they had, where they're just kind of leaning into, well, we know best, do what I say, not what I do, like Dyer's Eve, that kind of thing, where Lars is basically the parents from that song, Dear Mother, Dear Father. It's Lars, and Lars knows best, apparently, even though a lot of the recording production failures that the band has exhibited over the years can be attributed directly to him, I think, from hazing Jason to Rob, and just making his kit sound basically unlistenable at points, but also just the recording style. His effect on the band is sort of the opposite of Cliff Burton, I think, where Cliff Burton was really good for the band. They taught them a lot. I feel like Lars was the opposite. Keep it simple, stupid, and make the music sound bad, just from a production standpoint. And at this point, the band is so fucking famous that it doesn't matter. I feel like they could do something like Lulu and still sell merchandise, still tour. I don't think that they play Lulu live very often, but they can do albums like that and still have a career and still fall back on the old stuff. Like, they're not hurting as far as an audience goes. But anyways, bringing things back around to the whole point of the Metallica What If movement, I think, especially the first generation, was to change the tones and not lean so much into the compositional side of things. And then with the second wave, you're taking that and you're combining it with changing various other aspects like the drums and the bass, changing the riffs more extensively. And something that I would like to see, and if you guys need help with this, just reach out, but someone to change the lyrics, the way that they're written poetically, so that, they're less sing-songy. They sound more like the kind of lyrics that James would have written back in the day. Even though the ones here I think work really well, they could still be better just from a purely poetic standpoint. So, but I haven't heard anyone do that yet. So maybe that's for the third wave when Metallica does their next album in like 2028 or something. But as far as this goes, I really love what StateofMercury and Blake and Stacker have done, just in terms of working together as a team to really rework every aspect of the band, and it just feels like really vintage. So that's kind of the history of the What If Metallica movement, just the first generation and the second generation of that in between Metallica's two albums. And I've listened to the song once by State and Company. Now I want to listen to it again and just kind of give a play-by-play. And I'll listen to it and I'll sort of pause intermittently and just kind of listen to it a little bit, give some thoughts on it, and then I'll close out the video. So without further ado, here we go, second time around. All right, so one thing that I mentioned in my first listen, I just want to kind of rehash real quick, is instead of having a slow proggy kind of build up, they have just these sharp, powerful, biting chords right off the bat. Na, 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 na. The descending sort of chromatic power chords, those descending, minor seconds. And that's very much, from the Black Sabbath, Merciful Fate side of things. You can hear some of the influences that those bands had on Metallica, and that trying to recreate that's sort of what State's going for here. And instead of having that slow proggy kind of build up, you just lead off with something punchy right out the gate. And that's really something that they only did on Kill 'Em All. I mean, I'm sure there might be examples of that later in their discography, but it's something that is a lot less common because they would have slow build-ups with like Fade to Black, Sanitarium, The God That Failed, just different tracks from different albums. Damage Incorporated, where you just have the slow, and then go. Whereas here it's more like Beethoven's Fifth, where it's like dun 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 dun, where it grabs your attention immediately. And that's definitely more of a trademark of the band's writing style back in 1983. And I really like that here. It shows the first notes of the song, we know that we're going to get something different than what Metallica did in 2022. Kind of a refrain, almost like they're just kind of na 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 na, and then na 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 na, and then holding the note. Like the tone sounds really good, and the balance between that and the cymbals sounds fine. I like the toms, the way they come in from the right and then swing into the left. And there's a variation in terms of volume and speed. That's very much the classic Lars approach to playing. Whereas in basically from like Saint Anger onwards, he started really relying on his snare. So like Saint Anger, the song, where it's very, very fast, but it's literally just a fast snare pattern. And I remember hearing that song in high school and thinking, oh, wow, yeah, it's super fast. The tempo's like the fastest they've ever done. But it's just snare. And here, even on the original Lux Aeterna, he's still over-relying on his snare drum. The recording production is better, but here, it's like, what do they open with? Apart from those snare strikes during the na-na-na-na, you know, those downstrokes with the power chords, the first thing that it leads off with is a tom roll. I love that too. That pickup note, the pickup notes from the bass player before Lars, or the pickup notes from the bass player before James sort of leads off with that initial kind of scream, you know, from both of them. And I love that. It's like, and here we go. And it's like the bassist and the singer kind of kick off the song, you know, and then suddenly we're off to the races. But before that, you hear the guitars that are panned to the left. And it's just very, very much something that sounds vintage Kill 'Em All in terms of the production, but also the playing. Much more so than just the tone, but also the way the notes are played, the ways that you can't easily notate. It's more of like a feel and a style that is working with the tone. And that's why it's so important to have a good tone, because then you can emphasize notes with the tone. So you can't, I mean, obviously it's not something that you can't just change tone the way that you can raise pitch, but it is important, you know, if a band is playing with like a crunchier kind of sound or more like a hard rock kind of sound, it's going to affect how they play. Just because you can't stress notes quite the same way, it's going to sound different. And even with, you know, the twin guitars and the drums, I can still hear the bass. Like it's faint, but it's still audible. Another thing I'll say real quick is the snare sounds really good too. Every instrument on this particular recording sounds cleaned up, but still maintains that classic Kill 'Em All kind of sound. But it gels together really well. It sounds really, really cohesive and unified. I love that. You know, that spotty kind of snare riff, and then again you can hear the bass in between that, and the rhythm guitar and the various licks and riffs from that do kind of dominate the proceedings, but not to the point that they do on the original like recording. I think in that it's much more rhythm guitar, drums, and vocals. But it's much more, everything's kind of discreet and just kind of loud. It's like you get guitars, drums, vocals, and there's not a lot of space in between. And here I can definitely just appreciate a lot more. But it still sounds raw, you know, even though it's not dirty, it still gives off the overall feel, which I think is cool. Another thing I really love is the vocalist, and how instead of just singing in this monotone kind of way, he is really varying his voice every syllable. Like, he'll start off kind of low and then go kind of high, and he'll add in just a little bit of snarl or growl, and it sounds different with every single word. And it's a very articulate, coached performance that just works, as opposed to James on the studio recording of this song, where he just has a tendency to hold the high notes, but he doesn't vary very much until like the very end, where he ends with kind of just a little pop off. So he's like, Lux Eternal, and then whereas with this, it's like Lux Eternal, like and yeah, and so it's less like a heartbeat and more like a Richter scale or something like that. And it's funny because I know lyrically things aren't any different just on what's on paper and what the singer is singing, but he really makes it sound different. Like, a huge part of this kind of music and that evil kind of metal sound is like when you say words like thunder, you really have to like lion-o it, you have to sell it, and thunder or demons. And a huge part of it is you're kind of invoking that sort of xenoglossic feel where it's like you're channeling the spirit of evil, the spirit of chaos through your voice. And that's something that young James did really well, and I feel like has since been replaced by middle-aged dad James. And I love this particular recording by State and the boys because I feel like I'm being taken back to a time when they still had energy. I love that choppy kind of riff and sort of the bounce, and just he's really just leaning into it, putting his back into it with every single bit. And I could practically just envision him on the stage, and just his body is shaking from the effort that he's putting it all out there for the audience to hear. And you can see that like in early sort of stage performances by the band where they're just pissed off and they're there to give it all to their audience. And I feel like nowadays they still put on a fun show, but it's a fun show played by middle-aged men. Whereas this sounds like, all right, we're here, we're loud, we're pissed off, and you're going to feel what we feel. Yeah, really, apart from that, just the way that the different instruments, listening to this, I can pick out the snare, I can pick out the cymbals, the bass, I can focus on whatever instrument I want to listen to, but then appreciate it as a whole. And this is very much that Andy Carate style sort of effect. I called it the sound sandwich, where it's like eating a delicious sandwich where you can appreciate the individual like tones or layers, but then also enjoy it as just a whole sort of commodity that you can consume. And here it's like I can pick everything out or just enjoy it all at once, really. And that is really something to commend of State, is just the production and the way that he's brought everything together in the past, apart from just the compositional experimentation that he would do, which I always welcomed because I thought, you got to experiment to figure things out. But the audio production would sometimes be a little bit on the light side. But here, there's absolutely none of that. Despite the fact that this is cleaned up, it really does cook from start to finish. And yeah, just I really love and here, like, you have that kind of thing that the singer is doing He almost sounds like Macho Man Randy Savage. But I love that because I feel like later in his career, James would just sort of fall back on one particular kind of vocal fry. And here you can hear the singer kind of shifting between, like, the different parts of his throat and mouth and nasal passage to create basically a gradient of growls. And I can hear all the differences as he's singing. And it's a lot of fun. Also, a huge part of, like, the demons strangling your life. Singing about demons sounds a lot more impactful when you do have all of those growls. Like, I'm not saying you can't, like, be sort of ironic and have, like, this really, really demonic song that has, like, angelic kind of vocals. Like, it's totally a thing you could do. But I think part of the appeal of early Metallica, Kill 'Em All in particular, is that we're singing about fucking demons and just kind of like owning it, and really leaning into that performance in a genuine, heartfelt kind of way. And hearing, like, the demons that strangle your life and full speed or nothing. Like, but it doesn't sound like phoned in the Kool-Aid Man kind of way that James would do it later on. Like, again, it's like early in his career, James sounds like a live wire. He's channeling a force. And I think that Blake absolutely nails that. And I would be interested to see if he can do some of James's other vocal styles too, like from Ride the Lightning or Master of Puppets, Justice for All, the Black Album. Like, if he can capture the distinct feel of each one, because he totally nailed the way that James sounded in 1983. I like how the screaming doesn't really peak. Like, everything here is recorded really well, so there's no, like, digital clipping or distortion or anything like that. There's no, like, sharpness or stabs, unintentional stabs, and he doesn't really shriek over the instruments. Like, he sounds kind of ensconced within the band. So even though this has kind of a studio feel to it in terms of, like, the modern production techniques, it still sounds very full. And he's not able to sing over the instruments because, unless you have someone with a really, really powerful mic, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to outsing the guitars. You can hear that bass. It's been audible throughout the song, but here where you just have those da 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 da, and where it's largely just, instead of power chords, it's more like just distorted notes. That new wave of British heavy metal kind of approach to things, where you're almost like sort of playing out the melody one note at a time, and then the bass and the drums are the ones that are sort of really sort of punctuating things. And I think that I like that variation, being able to hear the bass a little bit more. Like, I'm not against, like, Iron Maiden or a similar band where you can just hear the bass consistently from start to finish. That's totally fine. But here, it's like you can hear it kind of, and then there are certain moments where, okay, you really want it to shine, especially when the other band sort of dials it back a little bit. I like that contrast. All right, this is the evil riff, and as far as I can tell, this riff is totally new. I could be wrong, but the riffs on Lux Aeterna are pretty repetitive, and in this particular instance, that's just not the case. It's very much just something that's, like, really raw, really fiery. It's like, all right, this is where the flames of hell rise up, and we do the demon dance, right? Kind of like that part in Indians by Anthrax, but also the Four Horsemen, where you have basically the chorus, and the guitar just totally goes crazy, and before the solo starts, and it's the refrain that's going to be repeating throughout the solo. So this initial opening of the riff, where it's just the riff by itself, it's playing, and you can really just appreciate how wicked it sounds, and very jagged, very loose and jumpy, but sharp in that classic James Hetfield early day kind of way. And the tone, see, that's why tone is so important, because this wouldn't work nearly as well on Metallica's new tone. I don't think it just wouldn't have the same effect. It wouldn't slice at you. It wouldn't burn. And here it absolutely does. You establish that, and then they go into the solo. And it's not announced by James. It's just something that follows the rising of the fire. Almost has kind of a... I did sort of compare the solo when I heard it initially to The Shortest Straw. The riff kind of reminds me of The Shortest Straw a little bit too. Like, it's clean, but it has that dark, malevolent, sort of bluesy, What If Merciful Fate and the new wave of British heavy metal had a baby kind of sound. And yet it's cleaned up a fair amount too. So it sounds like Kill 'Em All, but some of the songwriting sounds a little bit like the rougher, rawer sections of And Justice for All, which isn't a bad thing, honestly. So when you hear the wham wham where he's playing the power chord, you know, he's really stressing, because a power chord is basically a double stop. You know, it's just two notes played at once. So a double stop, when a lot of people think of that in blues, they think of like a minor third or a major third, minor third. I forget. It's been a while since I've held a guitar, so but in any event, just the third of a chord that you play in like a blues pattern on the third and second string of the guitar, and you just play it with your ring finger, that kind of thing. Well, a double stop can also be power chords, you know, where you're just kind of, you have that palm muting and you're stressing the note, and whenever he stresses the note, you can hear that while the solo is going on. So it just kind of leaps out. The individual like punctuated power chords are just kind of jumping out at you in a very spotty, almost dotted sort of pattern while the solo is going on. And they're coming at you from different directions, because the solo is on one side and then the riff is on the other. And while the riff is playing, you can hear the punctuated sort of bluesy power chords playing at the same time, and still be able to hear that evil kind of sound. And so you can listen to one and be like, this sounds good, and then listen to the other. It's like, yeah, that sounds good too. Or you can just appreciate them at the same time. Like, I like productions that give the listener a choice. And the solo itself feels very cohesive, where you have like just the instances where he's almost doing like the string bends, where he's kind of like bending the string, but there's a lot of energy and there's just enough variation where he's obviously like not repeating himself too much. And instead of James kind of hollering at an old aging Kirk, like, Kirk, it's your solo, it's time to impress people. Instead, what happens is the riff plays, that's Kirk's cue, and then you have a very energetic, youthful, sort of demonic kind of variant. It kind of makes me think of like a young Paganini, where Paganini was someone who, in his day, was thought to have been possessed by the devil. Like, he sold his soul to the devil to be able to play the violin as well as he did. And supposedly when he would play, like, he would roll his eyes into the back of his head. So he was like the metal musician of like the Baroque or the classical period. And I forget exactly which music period he came from, but it doesn't matter. Well, what people would more broadly refer to as the classical period, he was that demonic kind of persona. And I feel like here, the energy and the acrobatics of the guitar, where you're taking sort of the bluesy stuff and there's just a lot of really articulate phrasing, and it comes together in a way where the zombie version of Kirk that we have now in the actual band, it's just kind of like stitching things together to create like this zombie solo that does not have any of the youth or vigor of the old days. Whereas here, State's absolutely killing it. And I can hear other things too while the solo's going on, not just the guitar, but the cymbals or the snares. Nothing really gets in the way of anything. It's more like a beam of light and there's dust kind of swirling around it. And it's nice, you know. Nothing's really canceling anything out. There's no crossed wires, no mixed signals, you know. It feels very much like a comet streaking through the sky. It's very brilliant, but it lights up all these other details too. Lastly, one thing I wanted to say is the solo also goes on just for a little bit longer. I think it has a couple extra bars. Maybe it doesn't, but it sounds like it does. And the song's also faster, so like short of counting everything out, the solo, instead of feeling like, all right, we got to have a long enough section for Kirk to be able to play a solo, but we don't want him to get tired. Here it feels like State could just solo all night if he wanted to, and that's a really good feeling. And it just all sounds so good together in terms of the riff, in terms of the lead guitar, where you almost kind of want it to. So it's like, all right, keep going, all right, and stop. As opposed to like, oh, come on, we can make it, guys. Just another bar or two. Oh no, Kirk's getting tired. Okay. You know, it's a very different kind of feeling. I like that too. But just the little kick there at the end for character. That's a little bit of like dynamics where they're kind of have a like a start stop kind of thing, and it's like a little bit where there's drums and then just guitar, and then both again. So just as the start of the song sort of starts out where you have just the guitar, and then just like drums, and then they all pick up together. There's kind of a repeat or a coda of that after the solo. Yeah, I guess I'm gonna go out and say that I really like the volume of the bass. You know, I can hear it here. It's not too loud. I'm not sure how it would sound if it were any louder than this, but it sounds like, again, really authentic. But just as a listener and not someone who's concerned entirely with accuracy, it doesn't. It feels pretty appropriate. Oh, I love that. Lightning the Nations, where they're really selling that homage to Diamond Head. That works really well, but also just the riff. Like, it's just a really angry, pissed off sounding riff, or just the right amount of speed and aggression. And this is also where the song is closing out. So they're going to start holding the chorus a bit more at the end of the song. And then that no at the end. I guess the demonic sacrifice went wrong or something. And this is very much a song that's communicated largely by feel, I think. And it's funny because you have Metallica reinventing themselves, trying to sound like their old selves, but they don't really have the energy for it anymore. They have slick production values, and they just really can't. And they're kind of stuck in their ways from an audio recording sort of side of things, and they're a little too proud to bring on a third guitarist like Iron Maiden, because Iron Maiden, with their live performances in particular, they brought on a third guitarist. I want to say after Bruce left the band, there was another guitarist who joined. I don't know the exact history of Iron Maiden, but he never left the band. So you wound up with 3 guitarists: Adrian Smith, Dave Murray, and Yen something. And it allows them to do more live. And I feel like Metallica could easily do that. Like, look, Kirk, you can stay around. You can't do the solos. I mean, it happened with Glenn Tipton and Judas Priest, where they brought on Richie Faulkner, who replaced KK Downing. KK Downing went on to do his own band, and Richie Faulkner and Glenn Tipton do things. And then you also had the audio production engineer, who I think was helping the band do some of the guitars too. Maybe not during the live performance, though maybe. But 3 guitarists is better than 2, I think. And I think that that's definitely something that Metallica could do with their own stuff. But they're not going to, is my point. And the consequence of that is, again, they don't really have. They're reinventing themselves, but they're not. They just don't have what it takes to really play these songs the way that they did. And it's funny because given the same ingredients, where it's like you basically have a Cliff Notes version of a classic sort of Metallica song, and someone like StateofMercury can just take it and inject it full of energy, and he can do the guitars himself and then bring on a couple of other people, and it sounds as it should. And it's maybe Metallica, they're also trying to make as much money as possible by not just appealing to one particular audience, because if they lean too heavily into the metal side of things, the thrash side of things, then they're literally shrinking their audience and they're going to alienate them, which again, they're all about making that money because they don't want to do that. And they have deliberately chosen not to do that for years. They still have the hardcore fans that'll buy stuff like Saint Anger with a smile, or Lulu for that matter. But a lot of their stuff just sounds kind of like middle ground, compromised sort of sound, and I just wish it still had some of that spunk. And there you have it. There's no breakdown at the end. There was another version of the song that I responded to a couple of days ago that had more of a breakdown end, whereas this was more just a start stop, and then they would sort of have a double stop over that kind of, and just an extra voice basically, start stop, and then end, which is fine. But it definitely sounds different from that hideous train wreck of a breakdown that Metallica was trying to do, which honestly sounded like a rehashing of The Day That Never Comes, the breakdown that they had at the end of that, where they don't really have a sense of like groove or thrash anymore, but they're still trying to like do it, and it seems like really obvious, like they're trying to do a breakdown, but they can't anymore, and it just doesn't really work. So I feel like State deciding to kind of avoid the breakdown altogether in exchange for something that honestly sounds right at home on Kill 'Em All is a pretty smart decision. In any event, so that is the second listening of the song, breaking it down from start to finish. I'm going to cut the episode off here, and this time I did have the microphone on, so I double-checked and triple-checked that, so I'll upload this. If you like what I do, like, share, and subscribe. It's something that right now I'm doing for fun, but I definitely would like to talk more about metal on the regular. And if you guys are interested, it's definitely going to inspire me to just make more content. And not just Metallica, but all kinds of obscure bands and bands that I feel like don't get nearly as much love, especially newer stuff like Hellfire here, for instance, or this band Pursuit. on the new wave of traditional heavy metal full albums. Totally excellent album, just as good, if not better, than Metallica, and yet nobody knows who they are, you know? So I'd love to talk about shit like this. That being said, don't just support me. You can support State of Mercury, give him a like, subscribe, join, I guess, where you pay a fee, something like that. There's you can show support with super thanks. Like, there are all kinds of different ways you can support the band. He also has links to like his merch, Patreon, Twitter. They also have a Discord server. It's not as active as it used to be, but there are people who still show up on the server every now and then, and we do talk about stuff. So, you know, it's not like you have to do it, but it's there too if you want to talk to, you know, different people involved with these kinds of projects, and just the behind the scenes sometimes get discussed on there too. So it's, you know, if you want sort of a heads up on future projects, that's a good place to go. Also, go and support Stacker and Blake. Their YouTube channels are here. They both did a really awesome job. So like, share, and subscribe their stuff too. Absolutely. But in any event, guys, I'm going to cut the video off there. Thanks again for listening. If you made it this far, I appreciate each and every one of you. And I look forward to doing more of these in the future. Until then, thanks, and see you next time.